Look what you've done to my wedding dress! You useless, pathetic woman, you've ruined the most important day of my life!
A thunderous slap echoed through the luxury ballroom. Ashley, the bride, screamed in a blind rage. "Look what you've done to my wedding dress! You useless, pathetic woman, you've ruined the most important day of my life!" In front of hundreds of elite guests, Cynthia Ward was humiliated without mercy. Ashley pointed a finger at her face and shrieked, "Get out! Someone like you doesn't even deserve to breathe the same air as the Montclairs." The room went deathly silent. Not a single person stepped forward to defend her. Not even Marcus, Cynthia's own son. Cynthia silently turned and walked out of the Harrington Hotel, her dignity shattered. But as the blinding headlights of a luxury motorcade swept across the hotel entrance, Ashley had no idea that Slap had just ended her family's empire. Because the lowly woman she just kicked out was, in fact, the sole heir to a billion-dollar fortune. The grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Ivory drapes, cascading from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, crystal chandeliers casting their warm amber glow across tables dressed in white linen and gold flatware, 200 white roses, arranged in towering centerpieces that perfumed the air with the quiet insistence of something rare and expensive. Every detail had been chosen with the kind of precision that money makes possible and taste occasionally interrupts. The guests arriving through the gilded double doors wore gowns that cost more than most people earned in a month, and they moved through the space with the easy confidence of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged somewhere. It was, by every visible measure, a perfect wedding. And standing near the entrance in a navy dress she had ironed 3 times that morning, Cynthia Ward felt every inch of the distance between herself and perfect. She was 58 years old, a woman whose face carried the particular beauty of someone who had survived many difficult things without becoming hard, whose hands showed the evidence of decades of honest work, and whose eyes, warm, dark, steady, had learned long ago how to hold pain quietly so that others would not have to carry it. She smoothed the front of her dress, checked that her small pearl earrings were still in place, and walked into the ballroom where her son was about to marry a woman Cynthia had never quite trusted. Marcus Ward was 31, tall and broad-shouldered, with his mother's eyes and his late father's laugh, and he was standing near the altar, looking like a man whose happiness had finally arrived after a long, uncertain journey. He spotted Cynthia the moment she entered, and his face opened up in a way that it only ever did for her, that unguarded, boyish expression that reminded her of the child who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms and announce that he was not scared. He was just keeping her company. She smiled back at him, and for a moment, the enormous room shrank down to just the two of them. A hostess in a black uniform approached Cynthia with a clipboard and a smile that was professional but not warm, and directed her to a table near the far left wall, partially obscured by one of the large floral arrangements. It was the kind of placement that communicated something without ever having to say it aloud. Cynthia thanked the hostess and found her seat. She did not complain. She had not come to complain. She had come to watch her son be happy. The family of Ashley Montclair, that was the bride's maiden name, and she intended to hyphenate, which everyone in her circle had agreed was the modern and appropriate thing to do, occupied the front tables on the right side of the room. Ashley's father, Richard Montclair, had built his fortune in commercial real estate and maintained it through a combination of shrewd investment and aggressive litigation. Her mother, Diane, sat beside him, wearing a pale gold dress that had been custom-made in Milan and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. They were people who measured the worth of other people, the way they measured property by location, by appearance, by the company kept. Marcus had never fit neatly into their calculations, but he loved their daughter, and their daughter claimed to love him, and that had been enough to secure a cautious, conditional welcome. Cynthia, however, had never been welcomed at all. She had been tolerated. There was a difference, and Cynthia had understood it from the first time she met the Montclairs at a dinner that Ashley had arranged with all the enthusiasm of someone scheduling a dental appointment. At that table near the back wall, Cynthia sat quietly and watched the room fill. 2 women at the adjacent table glanced at her dress and then at each other, with the micro-expression of shared amusement that people sometimes forget is visible. A man in a gray suit walked past her chair without acknowledgement, though she had smiled at him. These were small injuries, the kind she had spent a lifetime learning to absorb without reaction, and she absorbed them now. She took a glass of water from a passing tray. She watched the flowers on the centerpiece, nearest her white lilies, with their heavy, sweet scent, and thought about how her late husband, Thomas, had always brought her lilies on their anniversary, because he said roses were for people who hadn't thought hard enough about who they were buying for. She thought about Thomas often at moments like this. He had been gone for 21 years, and she still had conversations with him inside her head, still heard his voice when she needed steadying. She was thinking about him now. She was thinking, Thomas, our boy grew up. Look at him. He grew up just fine. Ashley had spotted Cynthia the moment she entered the ballroom. She had been standing in the bridal suite corridor with her maid of honor, making final adjustments to her veil, when she saw through the decorative window the small, simply dressed woman making her way across the marble floor. Something tightened in Ashley's chest, not guilt, because guilt requires a belief that one has done something wrong, and Ashley did not believe she had done anything wrong. What she felt was closer to irritation, the particular irritation of someone whose carefully curated setting has been interrupted by an element that does not belong. She had tried, in the weeks leading up to the wedding, to suggest to Marcus that perhaps his mother might be more comfortable attending a smaller, more intimate celebration rather than the formal reception. Marcus had looked at her with an expression she could not read, and said simply, "My mother will be at my wedding, Ashley." And that had been the end of the conversation. So Cynthia was here, and Ashley had decided, somewhere between the rehearsal dinner and this moment, that if the woman insisted on attending, then the day's events would simply have to serve as a lesson in how the world actually worked. The bitterness in Ashley had not appeared from nowhere. It had been cultivated, quietly and consistently, by a lifetime of being told that certain kinds of people occupied certain kinds of places, and that the integrity of those places depended on keeping the boundaries clear. She had been raised in a world where worth was measured in visible markers: the address on an envelope, the label inside a jacket, the school name on a diploma, and by every one of those markers, Cynthia Ward came up short. That Ashley had never once considered the possibility that visible markers might be unreliable tools for measuring human worth was not, perhaps, entirely her fault. But it was, entirely, her choice to act on the belief. She watched Marcus greet his mother from across the room and felt something sharpen inside her. She turned back to her maid of honor and said, "Make sure the photographers stay focused on the main tables tonight." Then she smiled at her reflection in the corridor window and walked back toward the bridal suite to collect her bouquet. The years before the wedding, the years that Ashley Montclair had never thought to ask about, and Marcus Ward had never quite found the words to describe, had shaped Cynthia into someone that no amount of expensive fabric or prestigious venue could diminish, though Ashley would not understand this for several more hours. Thomas Ward had died of a sudden cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in October, when Marcus was 10 years old, and the world that Cynthia had built around her small family had simply stopped. The way a clock stops when its battery dies, completely, without warning, mid-motion. She had been 37 years old. She had a 10-year-old son, a mortgage on a house in a quiet neighborhood in Atlanta, and a savings account that held enough to cover approximately 6 weeks of expenses. She had a community of friends and a church she loved, and a grief so enormous that some mornings she sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes before she could stand up and make Marcus his breakfast. She stood up and made Marcus his breakfast. Every morning. She took on a second job at a dry cleaning business on top of her work as a hospital administrative assistant, and then a third job doing bookkeeping for a small restaurant on weekends, and she arranged her schedules so that Marcus always came home to someone. She turned down a marriage proposal from a kind man named Gerald when Marcus was 14, not because she did not appreciate Gerald's kindness, she did, genuinely, but because she looked at her son and understood that what he needed most in those years was the full, undivided certainty of her presence, and she was not willing to divide it. Gerald understood. He married someone else 2 years later and sent Cynthia a Christmas card every year without fail, which she kept in a drawer in her bedroom. She had found ways to be grateful for every version of things, even the hard versions. She had also, for 22 years, kept a secret. It was not a dramatic secret in its nature. No crime, no scandal, no buried shame. It was simply a secret born from a choice she had made when she was 26 years old and believed, with the absolute conviction of someone young enough to trust their own certainty, that she was choosing love over everything, and that everything would turn out fine. She had walked away from her family's business empire without looking back, changed the primary phone number through which they reached her, built a life that was hers in a way that the other life, the large, formal, obligated life she had been born into, had never quite been. She had not told Thomas the full extent of it until 2 years into their marriage, and Thomas had listened carefully and then said, "Cynthia, a person gets to decide what their life looks like. You decided. That's yours." She had loved him for that more than she could say. She had been careful about the phone. Over the years, contact from her family's representatives had come in waves, occasional, persistent, formal, and she had managed each wave with the same quiet firmness. She returned calls. She confirmed she was well. She declined invitations to resume any formal role. She donated to causes she believed in, quietly, through channels that kept her name away from letterheads and press releases. She was not hiding, exactly. She was simply living on her own terms, in her own scale, in her own way. On the morning of Marcus's wedding, sitting in the back of a car service arranged by the hotel, she had received a call from a number she recognized the main line of the firm that managed her family's affairs. She had answered it, kept her voice low, and confirmed that, yes, she understood, and yes, she would be in touch next week. She had ended the call and looked out the window at the city moving past, and felt the two halves of her life sitting side by side inside her chest, the way they always did when this particular world intruded on that particular world. She tucked the phone into her small handbag and thought about Marcus and about Thomas and about how strange and large a life could become when you were not paying attention to its scale. Ashley had noticed the call. She had been walking past Cynthia's seat near the back of the pre-ceremony area when she caught a fragment of it. The careful, authoritative tone, the words, "I'll be in touch next week," the way the older woman's posture changed almost imperceptibly when she spoke, straightening slightly, becoming very still. It was a small observation, and Ashley filed it away with the vague curiosity of someone who expects eventually to find that it means nothing. The ceremony itself was beautiful, in the way that expensive things arranged by people with good taste are often beautiful, technically flawless, emotionally curated, photographed from every angle. Marcus cried a little when he saw Ashley come down the aisle, and Ashley smiled at him with the warm, open expression that she kept ready for important audiences. The officiant delivered vows that had been written by a professional and then personalized by the couple, and the 200 guests watched with the collective satisfaction of people who have come a long distance to witness something memorable. Cynthia, from her seat near the back, watched her son's face during the exchange of vows and felt something move through her that was beyond happiness, something quieter and more permanent, the feeling of having done the essential thing correctly. She had raised this boy, she had kept him whole. He was standing here, and he was whole, and whatever came next, that would always be true. The reception began with the practiced efficiency of a well-staffed event. Cocktail hour in the adjacent room, then the formal dinner in the ballroom proper, then the speeches, then the dancing. Cynthia moved through the cocktail hour close to the walls, accepting a glass of sparkling water, watching the room with the calm observation of someone who has learned that watching is often more useful than participating. She was approached by no one from the Montclair side of the guest list. The few people who spoke to her were old acquaintances from her and Marcus's community. A woman who had been Marcus's elementary school teacher, a couple who had lived down the street when he was small, a pastor who had known Thomas. With these people she was warm and easy and laughed in a way that her face was clearly designed for. When the guests moved into the ballroom for dinner, the seating arrangements became more pointed. Cynthia's table was positioned along the far left wall, behind the third column from the entrance, with a clear view of exactly nothing important. The other guests at her table were peripheral. A colleague of Marcus's from a previous job who knew no one else. An elderly great-uncle of Ashley's, who had arrived with a hearing aid that was not working correctly, and spent the meal nodding pleasantly at things no one had said. Cynthia sat at this table and ate her salmon, and thought about what to say in her toast, which she had written and memorized, and now suspected she might not be called upon to deliver. She was not called upon to deliver it. The toasts preceded Ashley's father, the maid of honor, 2 college friends of Marcus, who told stories about him that made the room laugh. Marcus's name was called several times as the subject of fond, affectionate stories. Cynthia's name was not called. She watched Marcus laugh at the stories about himself and felt, briefly, a pang of something she quickly identified and set aside. She did not need to give a toast. She had already given everything she had to give to this man, and it was sitting there at the front of the room in his face and his laugh and the way he carried himself. That was her contribution. It did not need to be announced. But Ashley had been watching, and Ashley had been planning. It began, as these things often do, with something that could have been an accident. Cynthia had made her way to the edge of the main serving area near the end of the dinner course to retrieve a napkin she had accidentally left at the appetizer station earlier, and she found herself standing near one of the high-top tables where Ashley was holding court with a group of her closest friends. Ashley turned as Cynthia approached, and the look that crossed her face was one that Cynthia recognized, the look of someone who has just decided that the moment has arrived. Ashley reached for her glass of red wine with the slightly exaggerated gesture of someone making a point and managed, through what could theoretically have been clumsiness, to tip it directly onto her own ivory bodice. The red spread across the white satin like a wound. For a single suspended second, everyone around them was quiet. Then Ashley's face transformed. The composed, beautiful expression that had been in place all day shifted into something that Cynthia did not recognize as grief or shock but understood immediately, in the way that women who have spent a lifetime reading rooms understand things, as performance. "You did that," Ashley said, her voice starting low and building. "You walked into me and knocked my glass." Cynthia had not touched her. There was not a person in the vicinity who had not seen that there had been no contact between them. But there was also not a person in the vicinity who said so. "I didn't," Cynthia said, and her voice was steady. "I wasn't near you." "You were standing right there," Ashley said, louder now, turning slightly so that the arc of her voice would reach the nearby tables. "You ruined my dress. You ruined my wedding dress." Her voice broke on the last word in a way that was technically impressive. Heads turned. People stood. The crowd that had been dispersed around the room began to condense in their direction. Marcus, across the ballroom near the bar, looked up and went still. Cynthia tried again. "Ashley, I'm sorry about your dress, but I didn't touch you. If something spilled, I'm sorry, but don't apologize for things you didn't do," Ashley snapped, cutting her off. "Just stand there and tell me to my face that you belong here. At my wedding, at my table, in this room." The words were not really about the dress anymore, and everyone present understood this. But the crowd was frozen in that particular human paralysis that descends when something ugly begins to happen in a beautiful setting. "You don't belong here," Ashley continued, her voice rising to a register that cut through the ambient music and the murmur of conversation, and reached every corner of the grand ballroom. "You have never belonged here. You have never belonged anywhere near Marcus, and you certainly don't belong at my wedding." What happened next happened quickly and was witnessed by approximately 180 of the 200 guests, and all of them, in the years that followed, would remember it with a clarity unusual for something that lasted less than 3 seconds. Ashley Montclair drew back her right hand and slapped Cynthia Ward across the face. The sound of its sharp, unambiguous, final rang through the sudden, absolute silence of the room. Cynthia's head turned with the impact. Her hand went briefly to her cheek. The glass of sparkling water she had been holding hit the marble floor and shattered. Ashley's voice, after the slap, was strange and cold and very clear. "You don't belong here," she said. "Get out." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of complicity of people who had seen something terrible and were each, in their own way, calculating whether it would cost them anything to object. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd. His face had gone the particular gray of someone in genuine shock, the kind that slows the body and empties the mind before reality catches up. He was 31 years old, and he was watching his mother stand in the center of a ballroom with her hand against her face, and he had not moved. He had not moved. Cynthia's eyes found his across the crowd. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away. She bent down and picked up the largest piece of the broken glass, placed it on the nearest tray, straightened, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked toward the exit. She walked the way she had learned to walk through every difficult room of her life, not fast, not slow, not with her head down, and not with the rigid false pride of someone pretending they are not in pain. She walked like someone who knows exactly who she is and does not require the room's agreement. The crowd parted for her, without anyone appearing to decide to part. She walked through the gap and through the gilded double doors and across the marble lobby of the Harrington Hotel and through the revolving entrance and out into the night air, and then she stood on the sidewalk outside and let out a single, slow breath and allowed herself to feel the sting in her cheek. And then she looked up at the dark sky above the city and thought, with the clarity that pain sometimes brings, about Thomas. She thought, I need to go home. She was reaching into her handbag for her phone when the first set of headlights came around the corner. The cars arrived in a formation that was, in its own way, as theatrical as anything that had happened inside the ballroom. 3 black Rolls-Royce Phantoms, long, silent, gleaming with the particular luster of vehicles that are maintained by people whose job is maintenance, turned off the main avenue and entered the hotel's circular drive with a smoothness that suggested practice. They moved the way very expensive things often move, without apparent effort, with the quiet confidence of objects that have never had a reason to hurry. They came to rest in sequence before the entrance, and the effect of their arrival against the backdrop of the valet station and the ornamental hedges and the lingering guests who had stepped outside for air was immediate and undeniable. Doors opened. From the lead vehicle emerged 4 men who wore the particular expression of people whose professional function is to make other people feel safe. They were not large in a threatening way. They were large in the way of former military personnel who have been trained for specific situations and have the stillness of people who know what they are doing. They fanned out with practiced efficiency, one toward the drive's entrance, one near the lobby doors, 2 flanking the space where Cynthia stood. She had not moved. She was still holding her phone. She looked at the cars and then at the men, with the expression of someone who has expected to leave a party early and has encountered a slight complication. From the second vehicle, a man emerged who was not a security officer. He was in his 60s, with gray at his temples, and the upright posture of someone who had spent 40 years being the most important person in every room he entered. And he was wearing a charcoal suit that had been made for his specific body, by someone whose craft was obvious even at a distance. He walked to where Cynthia stood with a speed that was not quite urgency but was close, and when he reached her, he stopped. He looked at her, and then he did something that the hotel staff watching from the lobby windows and the guests who had drifted out from the ballroom and were now clustering in the lit doorway would talk about for a long time afterward. He bowed his head. Not the minimal, perfunctory nod of a business acquaintance. A genuine bow brief, but unmistakable. The kind of formal acknowledgement that carries weight because it is given by someone who does not give it easily. Madam Cynthia, he said. His voice was quiet, but carried in the still night air. My name is Robert Ashford. I am senior legal counsel for the Ward Family Trust. We have been attempting to reach you through proper channels for some time. I apologize for arriving here tonight, but the Trust's affairs have reached a point that requires your direct attention. He paused. I apologize also for the manner of this arrival. We became aware of the situation inside, and felt it was important that you know, before you left, that you do not leave alone. The people in the doorway of the Harrington Hotel guests, who had drifted out to see what the cars were about, hotel staff in their black uniforms, a photographer who had instinctively raised his camera and would later debate with himself whether to delete the images, all watched in silence. Among them, after a moment, was Ashley Montclair, still in her wine-stained dress, still holding her champagne flute with the unconscious grip of someone who is trying to hold on to something while the world reorganizes itself around them. And beside her, Marcus, his face, in the warm light spilling from the lobby, was doing something complicated, the expression of a man who is trying to hold several very large, very difficult realizations at the same time, and is not yet sure which one to address first. Cynthia looked at Robert Ashford for a moment. Then she said quietly, "How did you know where I was?" "The Trust has maintained a general awareness of your location for several years," he said, with the careful tone of someone presenting a fact that may not be well received. "We have not intruded. But tonight, the circumstances seem to warrant an exception." His eyes moved briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the mark that was beginning to show on her left cheek. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. She said it in the tone she had been using to say it for 21 years. "I'd like to get home." "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready." She was ready now. But Marcus had come through the lobby doors and was crossing the drive toward her, and she waited because she was his mother, and she had never in her life walked away from him when he needed her. The Ward Family Trust was not a small thing. It was, in fact, one of the larger, privately held logistics and transportation conglomerates in the southeastern United States, with subsidiary holdings in warehousing, distribution, and port operations that stretched from Georgia to Texas. The Ward named her name, the name she had been born with, the name Thomas had taken when they married in a quiet ceremony that her family had not approved of, had been on the side of trucks and on the letterhead of contracts for 3 generations. Her grandfather had started it with a single truck and a stubborn belief that a black man's business could outlast every obstacle placed in its way. Her father had grown it. Her older brother Lawrence had managed it for 22 years and had died without direct heirs 18 months ago, which was what had precipitated the intensified efforts to locate Cynthia and reintegrate her into the succession structure that the trust's governing documents demanded. None of this was known to Marcus. He knew his mother had grown up in Atlanta and had worked hard for everything she had. He knew his grandmother on his mother's side had died before he was born, and his grandfather when he was very small. He knew, in the vague way of adult children who accept the narratives they've been given without examining their foundations, that his mother's family had been comfortable her word, chosen with care, and that she had chosen to make her own way. He had never pressed. Children, even adult children, often do not press on the parts of their parents' stories that are presented with quiet finality. He pressed now. He stood before his mother on the circular drive of the Harrington Hotel, with the sound of his wedding reception audible through the hotel walls. Someone had started the music again inside, some attempt to resume normalcy. And he said, "Mom, who are these people?" Cynthia looked at him. She had the expression she sometimes got when she was about to say something she had been postponing for a long time. "These are the people who manage the business," she said. "My family's business. My grandfather started it. Your great-grandfather. I left when I was young. I've been separate from it for a long time, but it's still mine." She paused. "I always planned to tell you. I was waiting for the right time." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, at the hotel entrance, Ashley and her parents and several of their guests had gathered. The night air was very still. How big is it?" he said finally. She told him. Not the exact figure, because she was not certain of the exact current figure, but the range, the kind of range that changes the scale of everything around it, that alters retroactively the meaning of every dinner table at which his mother had ever sat, every dress she had ever worn, every position near a back wall to which she had ever been directed. He listened. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "You were sitting at that table in the back." "Yes," she said. "All night. Yes." He put his hand over his mouth and was quiet for another moment. Then he turned and looked at the group of people standing in the hotel doorway, and among them, Ashley, who had come outside at some point and was standing very still with her champagne flute held in both hands now, like something she needed to keep from breaking. Inside the ballroom, word had traveled with the efficiency that only gossip achieves. The murmur moved from table to table 3 Rolls-Royces, men in suits, Cynthia Ward, Ward Family Trust, billions. And with it, the atmosphere in the room changed the way weather changes, not all at once, but perceptibly, the pressure shifting, the temperature dropping, the light seeming somehow different. People who had watched Ashley slap Cynthia and said nothing now wore expressions of studied concern. People who had whispered about Cynthia's dress now spoke to each other in low tones about what a shame it all was. Ashley's mother, Diane, had gone very still in her seat, and Richard Montclair was speaking quietly into his phone with the focused attention of a man recalculating risk. Ashley had followed Marcus outside. The night air against the damp front of her dress was cold, and she held herself against it and watched the scene before her, her husband of 4 hours, his mother, the men in suits, the 3 black cars, and felt something that she was not accustomed to feeling. The particular vertigo of someone whose understanding of a situation has been proved not just incorrect, but catastrophically, humiliatingly incorrect. She had spent months, years really, since she first met Marcus and assessed his background, believing that she understood the terms of this marriage. She believed she was marrying a good man from modest circumstances, and that in doing so, she was doing him a certain kind of favor that he ought to appreciate. She had believed that his mother was a liability to be managed. She had believed, with the calm certainty of someone who has never had their assumptions seriously tested, that she was the most important person in this equation. She had not been wrong about all of it. She had been wrong about the parts that mattered. She put down her champagne flute on a nearby ledge and walked toward Marcus. Her shoes were wrong for the cobblestones, and she moved carefully, holding her skirt. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was different than it had been inside, softer, uncertain in a way she was not practiced at. "Marcus, Ashley," he said, and his voice was quiet and did not invite interruption. "I need you to not speak right now." She stopped. He turned back to his mother. The conversation between them was not long. The essential things had already been said, and what remained between Marcus and Cynthia in those minutes on the hotel drive was something that did not require many words. The old, durable language of a mother and a son, who had been through difficult things together and had learned to communicate in the register below speech. He asked if she was hurt. She said she was fine. He looked at her cheek and did not say anything. She touched his face briefly with her hand. He covered her hand with his. They stood like that for a moment. Then he turned around. He walked back to where Ashley stood on the cobblestones, and the quality of his movement was different than it had been all day. There was something settled in it, something that had arrived at a conclusion and was carrying the weight of that conclusion steadily. Ashley watched him come, and her face was doing things she was not controlling, a particular, visible effort to arrange itself into the right expression, and the failure of that effort and the strange nakedness of the result. He stopped in front of her. She said quickly, "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. It was the stress of the day, and he said, "When did you find out she might be connected to a trust or a business?" She blinked. I didn't, because I'm asking," he said, "whether you're sorry because you were wrong about who she is as a person, or whether you're sorry because she turned out to be wealthier than you thought." The question landed in the courtyard and did not go anywhere. Around them, the people who had gathered to watch were very still. Ashley's mouth opened and closed, and what it failed to produce was an answer. What it produced, after a long moment, was silence. And Cynthia, who had been standing a few feet away, watching, heard the silence and understood it the way she understood most things clearly, without the mercy of ambiguity. She walked toward Ashley. She did not walk quickly. She walked the way she had walked out of the ballroom, with the full weight of who she was, without apology and without aggression. She stopped at a distance that was conversational, and she looked at the young woman in the wine-stained dress and saw all of it, the fear, the calculation, the partial understanding that something had gone badly wrong, and the deeper, older failure beneath all of it, the one that had nothing to do with Rolls-Royces and trust funds. She saw a woman who had built her understanding of human worth on foundations that could not hold, and who was only now, in this moment, beginning to feel them give. "Ashley," she said. Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who has made peace with hard things, and can therefore speak about them without needing to wound. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Ashley nodded, once, slightly. "If I walked out of this hotel tonight, exactly as I walked in my old navy dress, with my small earrings, with nothing behind me but the work I've done and the son I raised, would you be standing here apologizing to me?" The night was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a car moved along the main avenue. Inside the hotel, the music had stopped. Ashley did not answer. She did not answer because she was, in this moment, the only honest version of herself she had perhaps ever been. And the honest version of Ashley Montclair did not know how to answer that question in a way that was both truthful and not damning. She was not a person without intelligence. She understood exactly what the question was asking and exactly what her silence was saying. She looked at Cynthia, and for the first time felt, in the full and accurate sense of the word, ashamed. Cynthia nodded. "That's what I thought," she said, not cruelly. "Thank you for being honest." She turned to Marcus. He was watching her with an expression that she recognized from his childhood. The look he got when he had done something he knew was wrong, and was waiting for her verdict. The most vulnerable, open expression in his repertoire. The one he had never quite outgrown. He was 31 years old, and he was looking at her like that, and she felt the old fierce tenderness move through her like a current. "Mom," he said. His voice broke slightly on the word. "I'm sorry. I should have." He stopped. "I saw what was happening, and I didn't." He stopped again. "Marcus," she said, "I should have protected you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, simply. "You should have." She let him hold that. He needed to hold it. "But you're holding it now," she said. "That matters." He crossed to her, and she held him her son, this 31-year-old man, who still had her husband's laugh, and the courtyard of the Harrington Hotel was very still around them. A few of the gathered witnesses looked away. A few did not. Marcus stepped back from his mother. He was still holding her hands. He turned and looked at the hotel entrance, where the doors to the ballroom could be seen through the lobby glass, and beyond them, the reception that had cost an amount of money that he now understood differently than he had an hour ago. He looked at Ashley. She was watching him with an expression that was, at last, genuinely uncertain. Not performing uncertainty, but feeling it. The real version. He looked at his mother's cheek. He said, to no one in particular, and to everyone present, "I'm not going back in there." Ashley made a sound, not quite a word. Her mother, who had come outside at some point during all of this and was standing near the hotel entrance, said, "Marcus, the wedding is over," he said. His voice was even. It was the voice of someone who has made a decision that costs something and has decided to pay the cost. "I'm sorry to the guests. I'm sorry for what this means. But what happened tonight?" He paused. "What happened tonight isn't something I can go back in there and celebrate. Not tonight. Maybe not ever." The response from the Montclair side of things was not simple or immediate. Richard Montclair spoke of contracts. Diane Montclair wept, in a way that was visible and insistent. Guests filtered out of the ballroom in ones and twos, gathering in the lobby and the courtyard, speaking in low, urgent tones that had the quality of people recalibrating. Ashley stood in the center of it, wearing her wine-stained dress, and looking, for the first time, like a person who was genuinely lost. Marcus did not go back inside. He sat in the courtyard with his mother, and Robert Ashford arranged for tea to be brought out from the hotel kitchen, and the two of them sat at one of the small courtyard tables while the reception dissolved inside around them, and they talked. They talked for a long time. He asked questions, and she answered them about his grandfather, about the business, about why she had left, about Thomas, about the years when Marcus was small, and she had worked 3 jobs, and what had been true in those years beneath the surface of what he had seen. He listened the way he had always been able to listen when the thing being said was important, with his full attention, without interrupting. She told him things she had held in the cupped hands of her private self for 2 decades, and the telling of them was strange and relieving, like setting down something very heavy that you have carried so long you had forgotten it had weight. At some point, the courtyard cleared. At some point, the lobby lights dimmed. At some point, Robert Ashford tactfully withdrew to one of the cars, leaving mother and son in the outdoor quiet of the city at night. She told him, near the end, about the scholarship program she had maintained for the past 12 years, quietly, anonymously, through a foundation whose name was not connected to hers in any public document. 63 young people had received funding through it. 3 of them were working in medicine. 1 was an engineer. 2 had started their own businesses. He did not know about any of this. He sat with the knowledge of it, and his face did something that she could not quite name but recognized. It was the face of someone whose understanding of a person has just grown too large for the frame they had been keeping it in. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because," she said, "I didn't want you to love me differently. I wanted you to love me the way you did when you were 10, when I was just your mother, and that was enough." He looked at her. "It was always enough," he said. She smiled. "I know," she said, "but it's nice to hear." The months that followed the night at the Harrington Hotel moved with a particular quality of time after a rupture both slower and faster than ordinary time, full of reckonings that rearranged themselves gradually into a new arrangement of things. The Ward family trust required her formal reinstatement as principal heir and chair of the board, which involved documents and meetings and a transition process managed by Robert Ashford with quiet efficiency. She returned to Atlanta. She found offices in a building downtown that she had passed hundreds of times without knowing was connected to her family's name on a deed somewhere. She sat in a boardroom and met people who had been managing portions of her inheritance for decades and who looked at her with a complex mixture of relief and careful assessment. She was not, as some of them had perhaps expected, overwhelmed. She was 58 years old. She had run a household on nothing, managed 3 jobs simultaneously, raised a son alone, and kept her own counsel for 2 decades. The boardroom was a larger room. The skills were the same. The scholarship foundation was formally brought under the trust's umbrella, which meant its funding could expand. She oversaw the expansion personally. She added programs in nursing and trades and early childhood education fields where the need was clear and the available funding chronically insufficient. She established a community endowment in the neighborhood where she and Thomas had bought their house, the one with the mortgage she had paid off by herself in 14 years. She did not make announcements about these things. She did not hold press conferences. The work happened, and the people it was intended to help received it, and that was, in her estimation, sufficient. Marcus rebuilt his life with the careful attention of someone who has had a significant illusion removed and is not certain yet what remains beneath it. The weeks after the wedding were hard, in the way that honest things are hard, not dramatic, not catastrophic, but requiring a persistent daily effort to keep moving forward. He went to work. He called his mother. He began, for the first time in a long time, to examine some of the assumptions he had been living with about Ashley, about what he had needed from that relationship, about what he had been willing to overlook in the service of a version of his future he had decided he wanted. It was not comfortable work. He did it anyway. He and his mother talked more in those months than they had in the previous 5 years combined. She told him, in pieces, the rest of the story about Thomas, about the choice she had made when she was young, about Gerald and the Christmas cards, about the mornings at the kitchen table, when standing up had felt like an act of will too large for the available willpower, and how she had done it anyway. He listened. He told her things, too, about the fears he had carried quietly, about the ways he had let himself be managed by other people's assessments of him, about the specific moment in the ballroom when he had seen what was happening to his mother and had not moved, and what he would carry from that moment, and what he intended to do with what he carried. She told him, "What matters is not that you stood still. What matters is what you do next." She said this to him on a Sunday morning in her kitchen in Atlanta, over coffee, with the October light coming in through the window, the way it had always come in, and it was, he thought, the most useful thing anyone had said to him in years. At an industry gathering in the spring, a regional logistics conference that the Ward Family Trust had sponsored for 17 consecutive years under his grandfather's charter and her father's continuation of it, Cynthia spoke to a room of several hundred people. She did not speak from notes. She stood at the podium in a dress that had been made for her by a woman in Atlanta who had been making clothes for 40 years and whose work was extraordinary, and she looked out at the room and spoke the way she had learned to speak over a lifetime of learning what was true. "I spent many years," she said, "living at a scale that was much smaller than my circumstances required. I did this by choice, and I don't regret it, because the smallness I lived in was rich in the ways that matter, in love, in purpose, in the knowledge of what I was doing and why. But I want to say something to everyone in this room, and I want to say it plainly." She paused. She looked at the room. "The world will tell you, many times, and in many ways, that you can measure the worth of a person by what they visibly possess. It will tell you this with architecture and with seating charts and with the tone of voice that wealthy people sometimes use with people who appear to be less wealthy, and the world will be wrong." Another pause. "The truest thing I know about human worth is this: it does not change based on what you can offer. It was the same in the back of the ballroom as it is at this podium. The only thing that changed is whether the people in the room could see it." She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. On a morning in November, 3 months after the industry conference, and 8 months after the night at the Harrington Hotel, 3 black Rolls-Royce Phantoms arrived at the glass and stone headquarters of the Ward Family Trust on Peachtree Street in Atlanta. The morning was cool and clear, The sky, the particular pale blue of autumn, the street busy with the ordinary traffic of a weekday. People moving past on the sidewalk glanced at the cars with the peripheral attention that expensive things in familiar settings attract, noted, categorized, released. The doors opened. The security team deployed with familiar efficiency. Robert Ashford emerged from the second vehicle and stood by the entrance, holding a leather portfolio under his arm with the expression of someone who has an 8 o'clock meeting and intends to be ready for it. Cynthia Ward emerged from the lead vehicle. She was wearing a dress the color of deep water, blue-green, structured, precise, and her hair was up and her small pearl earrings were in place, the same ones she had checked twice in the mirror on the morning of her son's wedding. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November morning light and looked up at the building at the name on the facade in restrained steel letters that bore her family's name and by extension her own. She had driven past this building for years without knowing what it meant. She knew now. She walked toward the entrance. The revolving door turned ahead of her. Behind her, the 3 cars remained at the curb, patient and silent, as they always were. She moved across the lobby floor marble, pale gray, with a quality of permanence that buildings built for legacy are designed to convey, and the staff who passed her nodded with the specific acknowledgement of people who understand who is in the room. She was not the woman who had been asked to leave a wedding reception. She was not the woman who had sat near the back wall behind the 3rd column from the entrance. She was not the woman who had absorbed small injuries in silence because the room did not deserve her reaction. She was all of these women, and more than any of them, and she carried them all with her as she moved through the lobby and into the elevator and up to the floor, where the boardroom waited, where the work waited, where the morning waited with everything it contained. The elevator doors opened. She stepped out. She walked down the corridor and through the glass doors at its end and into the light of a November morning in Atlanta where her work was waiting, and she was ready for it. She had always been ready. The room was simply, finally, the right size.